Thank you all. I know not all of you are here from your own free will, so I apologize for that, but glad to have you anyway. And it's a real pleasure to be back at Radley. I had a really good time last year, and the video we took of last year's talk has done very well on YouTube, so that is excellent. As I think everybody knows, and I know you've had a series here of speakers on the issue of free will. Free will has become a major issue, particularly in the United States, and I think slowly the United States once in a while exports something. It's been exporting these new ideas with regard to free will to the rest of the world, and certainly to the UK. In the US today, many universities have free speech zones, areas in which you can go and actually speak your mind with nobody censoring you. I always thought an entire university was a free speech zone. It turns out no, that only certain places within universities you can say that. Some universities have created what are called safe spaces, where you can go after you've maybe heard a lecture from somebody like me that has upset you a little bit, and maybe there'll be some teddy bears and soft music and something, somebody to ease your mind and to just calm you down. I am actually speaking, I'm doing an event next week, actually a week from today, at King's College London. And the student union there has demanded, as a condition for doing the event, that safe space marshals attend the event. These are people who are paid by the student union, paid fairly well, I understand, by the student union, to make sure that I and the other participants in this event don't say anything that might really offend the audience. And they have the authority to shut the event down if they believe we are offending people. Now, this has become quite prevalent in the United States. Now, I don't want to exaggerate the cause, because there's a lot of exaggeration about these things. It particularly has infected the best universities. So the further away you get from Harvard and from Princeton, and particularly from Brown University, the less impact these kind of ideas have. But certainly in the top universities in the United States, these ideas have real credence. They have real force. When somebody like Ben Shapiro, a conservative commentator with whom I agree with on some issues and disagree passionately on other issues, but fairly mainstream conservative spokesman, goes to some college campuses, there are literally riots in the streets where people get beaten up and pepper sprayed, and where the police stand by and let this happen, and he is basically prevented from speaking on campuses. Many speakers, even people like Condoleezza Rice, again, a conservative, but nobody particularly radical, served in the Bush administration, gets invited to speak on campuses. There is a demand to have her withdrawn, and many university administrations have succumbed to those demands, and they have not had the benefit of having her speak. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who I don't know if you guys here know who Ayaan Hirsi Ali is, but she is a brave woman raised under Islam, was forced into a marriage or arranged marriage. She escaped before the marriage happened. She landed up in the Netherlands. She is an outspoken critic of Islamism, of radical Islam, of fundamentalist Islam, a very courageous, brave woman. She speaks up a lot about issues related to the Islamic religion. She is now persona non grata on many American campuses because of her views, because of what she says might offend certain people in the audience. Now, I believe this might be the most important issue that we face today. This is the issue on which will determine whether Western civilization, in my view, will survive or not. Whether our quality of life, our standard of living, the freedoms that we take for granted will survive. This is not a trivial issue at the boundaries, as some issues are. This goes to the heart of what freedom means. It goes to the heart of what Western civilization is. So let's start maybe, before we get to really the core of what free speech is and why it's such an important issue, let's talk a little bit about Western civilization. Because one of the questions asked, well, are we on the rise or are we in decline? But there's a previous question that has to be asked. What is Western civilization? What do we mean when we say Western civilization? Because this has become a real contentious issue. Is Western civilization determined by the color of our skin? Is it determined by our religion? Is it determined by our ethnic background? What makes Western civilization Western civilization? And until we can define that, until we can explain what Western civilization actually is in coherent, succinct terms, it is hard to talk about a rise or a decline of this thing that I think we're somewhat afraid to define. And certainly, those who believe that it is the color of the skin that determines Western civilization, they are very vocal. So if we don't believe it's color of skin, as I don't, I believe it's ideas, then we better speak up, because otherwise they will be the ones to dominate the conversation. Those who believe it's religion that determines Western civilization, again, are very vocal. Those of us, like myself, who don't necessarily believe it's religion, need to speak up and define it. So I think the first thing that needs to be done, and this is already going to be controversial and contentious, is what is Western civilization? Now, I believe that Western civilization is rooted in two fundamental ideas, one a derivative of the other, but without which Western civilization is meaningless. Both ideas are ideas that come out of Greece, of ancient Greek philosophers, primarily Aristotle, and are embraced by what I consider the most important period in European history, or in global history for that matter, which is the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was when? When was the Enlightenment? Just to check if you're awake. Now, no, it's cheating. You're not supposed, they're supposed to answer. 18th century. So you can take approximately the entire 18th century. It ends a little before the end of the 18th century and begins maybe even in the end of the 17th century, depending on how you define it. But it's basically that period of the 18th century. And what is the core idea of the Enlightenment? And partially you can think of this as, who is the first thinker of the Enlightenment? Where does the Enlightenment kind of come from? And to me, in many regards, the first figure of the Enlightenment is not a philosopher, but a scientist. The first real figure of the Enlightenment is Isaac Newton. Because what does Isaac Newton teach us? Isaac Newton was a real revolutionary in many respects, because he taught us that we can explain the physical world not from reading ancient books, not from people telling us what the truth is, but we can explain it using logic, using mathematics, using observation, using experimentation. He taught us that science was efficacious. Science could explain the world. The human mind, by itself, could explain what's going on in the world. Reason was this incredibly powerful tool. And that's the first and most crucial idea of the Enlightenment. It's the efficacy of individual human reason. We do not need philosopher kings to tell us what the truth is. We do not need authoritarian dictators to tell us what is right and what is wrong. We do not need preachers and popes and mystics to explain reality to us. Reality is available to every single individual, as Aristotle explained, through our senses and our minds. We can discover the truth. And if we can understand how objects relate to one another, how force works in the world, which it's not that hard in physics now. You know, I know some of you are probably taking physics right now and think Newtonian physics is nuts, but it's relatively easy. The mathematics and the explanations are not that difficult. Most people get it. Yes, I can see what's going on here. And if we can understand the physical world around us, people started thinking in the 18th century, maybe we can make other decisions for ourselves as well. If reason is efficacious, then maybe we can make our own political decisions. Maybe we can decide what profession we should have, not be committed to a guild not be committed to what our fathers and grandfathers did, but actually choose for ourselves what we should be doing. Maybe we could choose our own leaders. And it's not an accident that Locke, right, is writing at about the same time about the rights of individuals. And individuals have rights because they can take care of themselves, because they can think, because they have reason. They have the capacity to understand the world and make decisions for themselves. They don't need other people. They don't need mother government. They don't need authoritarians to tell them how to live their lives. Now, we all take all this stuff for granted today because we're the great beneficiaries of the Enlightenment. Now, I know this is always tricky to a British audience, but probably the greatest achievement of the Enlightenment politically was the establishment of the United States of America. Because what does the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America declare to the world? That every individual has a right to his own life, his own liberty, and his own pursuit of happiness. Right? Why? Because he has the capacity to think for himself. And this is the second principle that comes out of the Enlightenment that makes Western civilization, and that is individualism. Again, coming out of Locke and coming out of the Declaration of Independence. The idea that what's of value is the individual, not the tribe, not the group, not the ethnic relationship, but who you are as an individual. That is what is sacred. That is the moral unit of importance. So two ideas make the Enlightenment: reason and individualism. That's Western civilization. People who adopt the ideas of reason and individualism, in that sense, are Western. People who don't, and they might live in the West, are not advocates of Western civilization. Is reason and individualism on the rise? In some places in the world. And they're in decline where they were born. In Western Europe, in England, and in the United States of America. And that's what we're fighting. We're fighting for the idea, not for an ethnic group, not for color of skin, not for religion, but for these two ideas, these twin ideas of reason and individualism, the sanctity of the individual and the competence of his mind, of his ability to know reality. Now, how is this related to free speech? Why is this related to free speech? Because if you have the right, if you can think, if you can create, then that thinking and that creation is meaningless unless you can express that creation. Unless you can express yourself in writing, in speaking. Galileo could have discovered the truth about, right, the earth going around the sun, not the other way around. But what gave it value and meaning to all of us, and to everybody, is the fact that he could express it. Now, he couldn't, right, because there was no free speech back then. So what happened to Galileo? He was put in house arrest. And of course, he didn't produce much after that, because he knew the consequences. The only way to discover truth is to argue for it. It's to argue against it. It's to debate. It's to discuss. Now, so the only way for us to discover truth, the only way for us to discover what's good for human being, what leads to human beings flourishing, what leads to human beings' success, is to use our reason, to look out into the world, to try to understand it, and to debate it with other people trying to understand it, and to figure out what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is false. So during this Enlightenment, one of the principles that they all agreed on, all the Enlightenment thinkers agreed on, is, wait a minute, if we are going to debate and think and try to discover the truth, what we don't want are limits on what is allowed to be debated and how we should debate. Now, it's true. A lot of people say stuff that has nothing to do with the truth, that has nothing to do with the pursuit of the truth. But then the question is, who gets to decide? What is in pursuit of truth? What is a debate that's going to lead to positive outcomes, and what's the debate that's going to lead to negative outcomes? Who gets to be the arbitrator of what speech is okay and what speech is not okay, what speech is going to lead to some great achievement and what speech is just wasted. Because a lot of stuff people say is a waste of time. A lot of stuff people say is just to insult. A lot of stuff that people say is just stupid. I mean, you might think that, I might think that, but who gets to actually decide? And who gets to actually shut the person up? One of the understandings that comes out of the idea that reason is so important, so crucial for human survival, is the idea that the enemy of reason is force. What prevents you from thinking? What stops you in your tracks? I mean, you can think under most conditions. You can advance the truth under most conditions. But there's one thing I can do to you that shuts down your mind, that stops you from thinking. And that's put a gun to your head. Tell you, if you think these thoughts, you're going to jail. Or if you don't do what I tell you, if you don't mouth what I tell you, I'm going to shoot you. You're just going to do what you're told, because nobody wants to die. Force is the enemy of reason. And therefore force, Locke argues, and many of the thinkers of the Enlightenment argue, must be extracted from human society. We don't deal each other with force. How do we deal with each other? With argument, with reason, with debate, with discussion. We're not going to agree. That's okay, as long as we don't punch each other. As long as we don't pull out guns on each other. It's okay to disagree. Disagreement is part of life. And again, who is to decide who is right or wrong except for you and me and everybody? Each one of us has to make decisions about what's right and what's wrong, what's true and what's false. There is no force in terms of making those decisions is wrong. It shuts down the mind. It prevents the discovery of truth. So the idea of reason is undercut when we try to limit the scope of truth, or the scope of speech, the scope of expressing one's thoughts. Now think about it. So people say, yeah, but some speech is offensive. Yeah. Almost every truth, new truth, is offensive. And now a lot of falsehoods are offensive too, but also truths. You know, Galileo really offended the Catholic Church. They were really upset. Every new truth, every new discovery, every new anything is offensive to somebody. Like Uber, everybody know Uber? Really offends taxi drivers. Any advancement, the automobile offended people who are building buggies. Anything new is going to be offensive to somebody. Does that give that somebody the right to shut you down because their emotions were hurt? So reason, our belief in reason, our dedication to reason, the idea of the efficaciousness of reason demands that we be allowed to speak. And that force be banned from human relationships. That you not be allowed to silence people because you don't like what they have to say. So what do you do with people you don't like what they have to say? You can argue with them, or you can walk away. You don't have to listen to them. Right? But you don't have a right to shut them up. You cannot use force against them in order to shut them up. If you do, then now you're setting yourself as an authority over what is right and what is wrong, what is true, what is good, and you're now limiting the scope of what you're allowed to think, what you're allowed to speak, what you're allowed to write. You're limiting the scope of where we can seek truth, seek what is right and what is wrong. You're limiting the scope of human thinking. You're limiting the scope of human reasoning. And you're saying, I, whoever the I is, the government, the university administrators, whoever they are now saying, we know what's good for you. We can now run your life. We can now make decisions for you. You're undercutting the very foundation of freedom and liberty, which is the individual's ability and right to think for themselves and therefore to express themselves. One other thing that's happening in our modern culture. Whereas we used to regard reason as our means for knowing reality, we used to regard reason as the way in which we arbitrate disputes and discover the truth. It seems like over the last few decades, we have elevated emotions above reason. So now it doesn't matter whether what you're saying is true or false, right or wrong. What matters is what kind of emotion it invokes in me. If you say something that upsets me, then you're not supposed to say it. We've elevated emotions as our guide to what is true and what is not. But what are emotions? Where do emotions come from? And can we trust our emotions to tell us what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad, what is true or what is not true? Right? Our emotions don't want to understand Newtonian physics. It's too hard. Right? Where do emotions come from? They're just there? Where do we get them from? What's that? Chemicals in the brain. But is it just random chemicals? So, you just happen to have a certain emotion. It's just whatever chemicals happen to be in the brain at that point in time. What's that? Your subconscious, again, so in a sense it's something that you're not in control of. That is absolutely true. But why is it that you have a particular emotion from a particular cause? Right? What is it? I don't know, that you feel fear when you see a dog bark. Some of us feel fear. I'm afraid of dogs. Some of you might not be, right? But I might be, and you might not be. What is it? We have different chemicals in our brains? Why is my subconscious reacting in one way and your subconscious reacting in a different way? Genetics. So some would say it's genetics. We're determined by a certain genetic code in our minds, and that determines what emotions we will have. It turns out that many of these emotions we don't have when we're little, that we kind of develop them as we grow up. Where do emotions come from? Yeah. What's that? We've been brought up that way. So we've been brought up to have certain emotions. Now there's a lot of truth to that. Right? I believe emotions come from conclusions we've already made in our mind. So we've come to certain conclusions because we were brought up that way, because a dog scared us when we were 3, because of whatever conclusions. We've come to some conclusions in our mind. And it's automatized, so it's in our subconscious. So now, when something triggers it just happens. Does it mean it's right? No. It just means that our subconscious is feeding us this emotion right now in response. How do I know if something's right or wrong, whether the dog is really scary or not? I look at it. Is it, what's its behaving? How is it behaving? I think about it. Is this a type of dog that's dangerous, or isn't it a little poodle, right? Or is it a dog that's not dangerous? I use my mind. I use my senses. I use my reason to discover the truth. The emotion is just telling me, based on past things that have happened to you, this is how you are responding right now. So what? I mean, you guys are too young for this, but you fall in love. You love this girl. We're almost all boys here, right? You love this girl. And you're in love, right? Heart's beating, it's really powerful emotion. Because you believe certain things about her. And then you discover something negative. She's cheated on you. Your emotion, you reason that, she's no good. You don't want to have anything to do with her. It takes a while for your emotions to catch up. Because emotions tend to lag. That's why we hold on to things that we know are not good for us anymore. Right? We know certain foods are bad for us, but emotionally it's hard to give up. Now, I'll tell you, if you actually convince yourself that some foods are bad for you, and you take it seriously, and you think about it enough, you stop desiring those foods. I gave up on dessert tonight, right? Right? Quite easily, it was no temptation, because I don't do desserts anymore. It used to be hard. I used to have to work at it, right? Really have a mental effort around it, but you automatize it. What should guide your life is your reason, not your emotion. If you're getting upset because somebody says something, so grow a spine. Is it what they said true, or is it false? If it's true, you should thank them. If somebody criticizes you, then it turns out the criticism is true, then you grow because you've discovered something new about yourself you didn't know before. You should say, thank you. I didn't know I was doing X, Y, Z, right? If it's false, if somebody criticized you and they're wrong, why the hell do you care? It's their problem that they're wrong, not you. If you hold something that's wrong, it's your problem. If somebody else holds something that's wrong, it's their problem. So if somebody comes up here and says something outrageous that you find offensive, then it's the speaker's problem if what they said is false. And it's your problem if you're getting offended by something the speaker said that's true. If something they said is true, then you should think about it. You should consider it. You should change your mind. But to silence the speaker is to silence thought. To silence the speaker is to silence reason. To silence the speaker is ultimately to silence everything that's made Western civilization a success, which is the ongoing, constant pursuit of truth, the ongoing, constant acceptance that the evaluator of what's right for me and what's right for you is you. I get to decide for myself, and you get to decide for yourself. There is no authority, right? And right now you're in school, so there is an authority. It's called your teacher, and you better answer the exam questions right. But in life, there is no authority. There's you. That's it. You get to decide what's right, and you get to suffer the consequences when you're wrong. You are your final authority. And the person on stage, whoever it is, they're their own final authority. And if they're wrong, and they might be wrong, that's their problem. That's their issue. So my view is freedom of speech should be absolute, right? As long as it doesn't turn into action, right? As long as it's not inciting violence, right? As long as it's not involved in committing fraud. But all of those, in a sense, are actions. They're meant to act on other people, to get other people to do something they wouldn't otherwise do. But if you're not inciting violence, and if you're not committing fraud, then you should be able to say whatever the hell you want to say. Nobody should be forced to listen. Now, I guess you guys are forced to listen to me tonight, but nobody should be forced to listen. People should be able to walk out. People should be able to boo. People should be able to object. I have no problems, and I've had it plenty of times, of audiences booing me. Great. You're expressing your opinion just like people clapping, right? You should be able to, you have the right to express your opinions just as I do. But you don't shut me down any more than I shut you down, in a sense of the ability to speak. If people are too sensitive to hear certain ideas, then I think we've got a real problem in controlling our emotions. Again, we've elevated emotions above reason. Emotions are not tools for discovering truth. Emotions are not tools of cognition. I mean, emotions are great, don't get me wrong. You want to feel, right? But you don't want to be guided in your life by your feelings. You should be guided in your life by your reason, by your mind. So, Western civilization is reason and individualism. Reason depends, relies on our ability to express ourselves, our ability to convey what we believe is true and right to other people. Nobody has the obligation to believe us. Nobody has the obligation to listen to us. But all of us have the obligation to leave people alone, to not use violence, not use force against them. If we value Western civilization, if we want Western civilization to continue its march towards progress and its march towards truth, we must allow freedom of speech. Thank you all.